Good evening and thank you for joining us. You're watching live with Faye. Very interesting development that has just come out. A gazette notification has been put out by the government. The central government has now brought digital audio-visual content, including films and web shows on OTT platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hotstar, whatever you have it. All of these streaming platforms, as well as news and current affairs on online platforms under the ambit of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Now, there has been, obviously, this has caused a certain amount of nervousness among people who worry that this would limit creative expression, it would bring in censorship, it would bring in control over digital media. But we're going to try and understand if any of that is really possible and what this notification actually means. To remember, there are many questions to ask. Will, for example, the films and the shows that go up on OTT platforms, will they now be required to get, say, a censor board certification? Will there be any sort of control placed over news that's done online? Will that also, in a positive sense, allow for a control of fake news? Because remember, the news you read from a newspaper or you access from television channels gets permission from the government to operate as news organizations. As of right now, digital news doesn't need such permission. One could also argue, which is why anyone with a camera or a phone can post what looks like news on the internet, and it might not actually be real news. It could be fake news. So is this a way to control the fake news as well? Is that a good thing? So many questions about what this means and how it's likely to play out. Joining us right now to help us understand those questions, Abhinandan Sekhri, who's the co-founder and the CEO of Newslaundry. We have Dhanya Rajendran, who joins us as well, co-founder and editor-in-chief of News Minute. Apar Gupta, executive director of Internet Freedom Foundation. Nikhil, Pahwa, founder of Medianama. Both Apar and Nikhil have actually been studying this a great deal from the time it was actually mulled about by the government, and now we're actually seeing it come into play. And we have Varun Duggirala, who is the co-founder and content chief at The Glitch. So thank you all for making time and joining us with what is going to be a very interesting conversation. If I may start with, Nikhil's not here already, but Apar is here. Apar, I know that you spent some time studying this regulation. If you could please tell us what you believe this means. Are the fears that this would be censorship, perhaps, a knee-jerk reaction? Because technically it's the same ministry that looks after television news, and it looks after newspapers, and it looks after films right now.
Yeah.
And they all seem to be functioning. So Are we sort of jumping the gun?
I don't think so. We're jumping the gun. So what does this notification mean? It essentially, for the internal conduct of business within government, has clearly stated that there's a nodal ministry. It's the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and it'll look at news and current affairs online, as well as general entertainment, which is through OTT platforms like Netflix, Amazon, etc. Now, the thing is, it will require follow-up action in terms of legislation in order to now have these powers. So the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting will be the central ministry which will then exercise regulation, and there are steps to follow in terms of a law which may be created. Now, what have we seen in the past, and why does this nervousness arise at present? Firstly, with respect to news and periodicals, there is a pending legislative proposal on the registration of press and periodicals. There's a bill in 2019. It was in December last year, and it was essentially doing that same thing, right? It was requiring the same regulatory compliance, at least contemplating, which is there for newspapers, for online digital news media portals. However, the thing is, the online news media business consumption, as well as what it allows in terms of a much more open space, which is critical of the government, which is the role of the media, has been a growth of the absence of a large amount of regulation in terms of licensing that you need to go and register with the government. And secondly, in terms of content controls, that what you can say, what you cannot say. This does not mean they can say anything they want. laws of defamation, obscenity, etc., all apply to them. So it's very important to consider. And the second is that they already have pre-existing controls in terms of stakes which can be invested in these kind of businesses. And I think that hurts a lot of growth in this area. Why I say it's different, just from the perspective of news, OTT is very clear why it's different. With respect to news, is we also see very innovative formats which are emerging. For instance, newsletters, platforms which are devoted to single issue audiences. For instance, subscription-based models on technology and journalism. And I'll stop here. But the larger question we should ask is, when we go for regulatory parity under antiquated objective of the registration of press and periodicals bill, for instance, in which the original contemplation was that everything which is printed, there should be a copy with the government in a public library. I don't think so that holds true for the internet. And there are better ways to check fake news and disinformation.
Right, I'll come back to a lot of things that you raised, like simply how would anybody, validate this if every news organization on the internet, for example, had to, hypothetically speaking, register themselves just like television and papers. Does this mean nobody can post on YouTube? Does this mean nobody can post on Facebook if they're not registered? And how would you then take stuff down? I have Dhanya Rajendran with us, and apart from being an entrepreneur and an editor-in-chief and an experienced journalist, Dhanya is also, the first chairperson of DigiPub News India Foundation. Now, this is, 11 Indian digital organizations have come together and created an association of which Dhanya is the first chairperson. Thank you for joining us. What is your reading of this right now in all of these roles that you currently play? Do you see this as a problem, or do you see it as a sort of logical continuation of what's already the regulation for the traditional or the mainstream media?
See, Faye, the government deciding to bring digital platforms, I'm just going to talk about news websites for now, under the Information Broadcasting Ministry. Perhaps if it was a sudden announcement, or if it was an announcement in good faith, we would have been okay with it. But what adds apprehension here are the events that we have seen that played out in the last few months, when the Sudarshan TV's Love Jihad case came up in the Supreme Court. When the union government was asked about their reply, I think at least twice the union government told the court that if we wanted to regulate someone, it would be digital media. Then a few days ago, we saw the union government saying, projecting as if they are helping the digital media by allowing FDI of 26%. Actually, it was FDI at 100%. Now it's been reduced to 26%. So the concern here is that the policy has been made simply with the vision of censoring and also limiting the business of censoring the content. For example, both of you were talking about fake news, right? If that is the government's concern, I can tell you at least 5 or 6 states, here at least in the southern states, every government has this anti-fake news task forces. They have at least 20 to 25 cops, IAS officers as part of these task forces. They hardly do anything. And most of the time, they're only interested in any news against the government, which they brand as fake news. So there are a lot of issues here, right? What does the government actually want to do? There's been no discussion with any of the stakeholders. So since the government has already made this announcement and there is a gazette notification, we can only hope that if there are regulations that the government is going to form, that at least from now, there would be discussions with stakeholders.
Right, so there's been no discussion with stakeholders, and technically we don't know what these regulations are going to be. Now, one could also argue that they would have to be on par with what newspapers and television channels are currently under, because that's the logical thing, and they would have to hold up in a court of law as well. But let me bring in Abhinandan Sekhri, CEO, co-founder of Newslaundry. Abhinandan, does this make news on digital media effectively unviable? Because if you're saying that right now you cannot bring in foreign direct investment of more than 26% with government approval, that makes it difficult to expand. Now, unlike the television channels or the newspapers that have a lot of local investments already in them right now, we know that digital media needs investors. Does it make it, does it make the future, like Dhanya was saying, the future of these organizations a little worrisome?
It absolutely does. And I can tell you the one hope of news being reclaimed by journalists such as yourself and Dhanya and others was the digital space, because where broadcast has gone is evident and clear for us to see. Digital was the place which was reclaiming journalism. We saw a lot of good journalism coming out of it. Like Dhanya said, if you see the sequence of events of how they're trying to get a regulatory framework around investment, then getting a regulatory framework around content, now that doesn't have to register and get it under the Information Broadcasting Ministry, it is clear that a culture of governance that is used to control is going to do exactly that, because there is no logical reason. And also on technical grounds, what Apar said already, of how, the kind of laws that there are existing to take on many of the issues that they claim to want to take on. Now, I'll just read out a few things from the Ministry of I&B website, right?
Yes.
Now, this is from, this is 17 pages. I'll just read out maybe 1.5 pages. 12th of December 2016, advisory to 90TV 24/7 for violating programming code. 12, same date, advisory to NDTV India for violating programming code. Advisory to content on FM radio channels. Order dated 2/11/2016, prohibiting transmission of NDTV India channel for 1 day. Okay, this is just 4 entries. There are like about 100 such. Then advisory to all private TV channels to ensuring strict compliance with programming code. Advisory to Comedy Central, and Comedy Central taken off air. Advisory, observance of International Yoga Day 2020. You just read this and you read the kind of advisories and the bans that have been prescribed 2016 onwards. Usse pehle to bhul hi jao. So right now they can't do this to digital. And like I said, I have read half a page. There are 17 pages of these entries. You just go on their website. Now the technical aspect, whether broadcast, print and digital are the same. No, they're not the same. So they cannot be treated as the same. There is an entry barrier to broadcast. If I am buying uplink and downlinking rights from the government of India, they're giving me a license. I'm using the airwaves, I'm using spectrum that I'm buying from them, and that comes under a certain regulatory framework. I am not buying any spectrum. I'm paying Geo or whoever, or the servers that I'm paying. The government is not providing me anything to do this. What is the entry barrier? Are you going to block anyone who's not registered in India? And also, I don't want to bore your audience, but they should go to the I&B Ministry website and read the content code that they have, that you cannot put anything that may spread disharmony. You cannot spread, what disharmony gets spread. So, I mean, I don't think anyone is fooled why this is being done, because technically it is not possible. It is just to harass people as and when they choose to harass people. It is not executable, and it is not sound in law.
Okay, so I come back to you, but my team has just told me that Dhanya Rajendran has to leave in 5 minutes. So if you want to add something before you have to go, because then I'll get the rest of the panelists to respond to what you have to say.
No, so I want to add that see, a lot of people have been asking for reactions today, and I realize that we do not have any idea what the government plans to do. No, we can only expect that they will have a regulatory code, like Abhinandan said, which will say do not disturb communal harmony, or do not do fake news, those kind of things. But other than that, there are so many questions, right? Many of the digital websites today depend on subscriptions, on memberships. Is the government going to put a cap saying that you can only charge this much, you cannot charge beyond that? So I don't understand what the government intends to do. The problem is that till now, what the government has done, considering that we do not have faith in what they will do in the future. So that's my only point.
Actually, that's a very strong point. The fact that nobody knows. So we're having this discussion right now. All we know is that the government has given itself the power to regulate this particular sector. But what that regulation will look like, we don't know yet, which is why Nikhil Pahwa joins us right now. Nikhil, I know that you've been looking at this a great deal. Same question that I asked Apar Gupta in the beginning. Are we overreacting? Was this a given? This is what it looks like in television and print right now. 26% FDI, regulation by the I&B Ministry, self-regulation by a body of, a self-regulated body that they create as an association among themselves. So is there anything here that makes you nervous?
No, I mean, Faye, Abhinandan and I have been, excuse me, have been discussing this for a couple of years now. So none of this is a surprise because we've seen the slow burn that has brought us to this particular place. What I've also noticed is that there's a significant amount of involvement of the traditional media players, that instead of trying to liberate the digital media and trying to liberate themselves, they are trying to bring us down to their level by imposing these regulations. They had lobbied very strongly for that 26% limitation that was put. Of course, at that point in time, Prakash Javadekar went out and called it that we are encouraging, for the benefit of digital media, we're allowing 26%. But frankly, that was never the case. And one very clear case in point is actually News Corp's acquisition of VC Circle that took place. And now, after this cap has come in, after this cap was announced, VC Circle has now been sold by News Corp to Mint. And so, because News Corp either wants to be 100% in a news and media business, that is the Murdoch philosophy, or they want completely out of it, right? So we've seen one negative impact of that, where News Corp has effectively exited the country, or exited VC Circle to Mint at a significant reduction in valuation. I think they sold it for 6 crores, and from what I remember, when they bought it, it was for about 36 crores. So, I mean, none of this is confirmed, but this is what we'd heard then. So, I think this augurs, it's a cause for concern for all media entrepreneurs, digital news entrepreneurs in the country, that that exits, acquisitions, etc., will be contained within the country, or they'll have to register outside India and then service readers. And I'm sure the government will then start looking at ways of capping or addressing those loopholes. So it's just a first part of the process. Digital media makes this government really nervous, and because they don't have any control over what we say online. And I remember a conversation I had with the founder of a news publication many years ago, and he said that we should come together, form an association, lobby for for recognizing us as legitimate media entities, so we can get a press card, etc. And my response was, what kind of a protection does a press card give to you in this country? All it does is gives you access to government press conferences, right? So I would rather have the freedom of speech and the lack of registration of my business as a media entity with the government, because it gives them fewer levers to control us with. This particular move and the RPP bill that is on its way is essentially a means of trying to regulate digital news media. My question is, how do you even define digital news media? Is Faye running her channel personally, for example, if not the company that you've registered, but if you run a channel personally, would you come under the ambit of digital media? Would Dhruv Rathi's YouTube channel, Akash Banerjee's YouTube channel, would they come under digital news media? I don't know. If I'm running a personal blog where I'm writing my views on current affairs, would I come under digital media? That's how I started Medianama, for example. That the objective was essentially to share.
Yeah, so what Vivek called us, for example, which is...
Exactly.
Yeah,
so would Vivek Call have to go and get a government registration to just blog?
But when he says he doesn't know, I can tell you for sure, even those sitting in the government don't know. They will decide as and when someone pisses them off. Okay.
Which is exactly the point.
Thousands of people are they going to register? There are so many YouTubers, and there are so many people using other platforms.
Take them down. So here's the question, right? So what will it? Let's assume there is a YouTuber who does not register and continues to post content. Will YouTube have to take the channel down? Will it no longer? What if this person is not?
Look at how radio is regulated. Radio cannot still do news, right? So what if tomorrow the government says people on YouTube cannot do news?
Also, if the person is not currently based in India and is based outside the country, can they not talk about India? In that case, can the New York Times not talk about India? This is, I mean, it's untenable on so many levels.
So you've created a regulatory environment where you have more freedoms if you were servicing the Indian market from outside of India than from within. And how is that supposed to be for the benefit of the industry? That's never made sense to me. And frankly, I think the government just wants to keep a tight leash on those who are operating within the country, which is basically creating an incentive structure to get out of the country and register in Singapore, which is, I guess, what many news businesses will eventually look to do. And then they'll have these data localization protocols, and they'll start having more and more restrictions. So they'll start blocking sites eventually that service India with news but don't operate from within India. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know, because then they'd have to effectively block every single global news organization. The Washington Post, for example, the New York Times, the BBC, are they not to report on India if they're not registered in India? So we've had and I'm going to come back to details about things like government ads and all of those details that are going to be brought in. Varun also joins us. Varun, from the creative ends of things. So we're talking about the fact side of things, but there's the fiction side, the OTT side that's making a lot of people nervous. Now, our understanding is the INB ministry currently also, is the regulatory ministry for film and for television. That is not news, so entertainment. And film is required to get certification from the board of film certification, or what we call the censor board. We don't know, like I keep saying to our viewers, we don't know if that's going to happen to OTT platforms. But I want to ask you, Varun, as someone who works in the creative space, do you feel that this is going to be a problem for the creative expression of what we're seeing happen on the internet right now?
So it'll honestly take us back to when we only had television available to put content out there. I remember when I used to work in television, and we would always have a long list of guidelines basis what we can do, cannot do. Don't put this out there, channel will get banned. And this has been there for a long time, right? Digital gave people the opportunity to do that. What I feel that if I'm a creator today and I'm making a series, I know television won't buy it, so I go to an OTT. But what might end up being my future is, okay, I can't go to an OTT who's an established player because they'll go under the same problem the television channels will go through. Maybe I'll just put on my YouTube channel and figure a way to monetize it, because the chances of them targeting me as an individual might be lesser than them targeting a larger organization. So it takes away a huge monetization opportunity we have, because right now for India, if I'm a creator, I have so many options, right? One of the biggest ways I kind of make money is to kind of go to a platform and get them to fund it. Now I'm a little worried because I'm thinking about, okay, will someone buy it? So I'll go back to my PG-13 days. I'll go back to, that kind of content, and everyone's going to start playing safe again. We're back to that, that kind of a mindset.
It's odd that we consider what is on television right now as safe, because I consider it among the most destructive things that could possibly be shown to a mass audience. But Varun, I don't know if Nikhil wants to come in, but very quickly, this question to you: the putting things, on you did say, of course, creative freedom and things like that. One could also argue, if I were to argue as devil's advocate, that currently on OTT platforms, there's nudity, there's violence, there's bad language, there's all of these things that, our country likes to frown upon. And there's been raised that why is this being allowed when it's not allowed on television? It's not allowed in movie studios. What's your response to that?
So I have a theory, and it's not just a theory. I think it's a fact, is that more in the beginning when OTTs came up, a lot of platforms saw it. Okay, what will get eyeballs is the same problem that television had at some time back, right? That this whole term of sex sells is what used to be there. They tried, first thing, default mode, everybody went towards that. But honestly, if you see the content coming out and which is done really well in recent times, and I'm talking fiction, I'm talking non-fiction, etc., it's been the stuff that actually has some sort of depth, right? I mean, the fact is that if everybody around is talking about Scam 1992, it's because it's a great piece of content. They're not talking about, let's say, Gandhi Baat or any of the other ones which were around. Primarily because those things, you don't talk about watching them. You might watch them, but you won't share them. These are things you share about. So I think we've finally matured from an OTT creation standpoint to creating good content now across the board, right? All platforms are creating good content. And so I would say that if that was the attempt, that problem has had to solve itself. While you'll still have some fringe pieces, and globally you have a lot of content that is trash, right? And there are tons of people who like to watch trash. What a streaming platform gives you is the option to choose what you want to watch. If you are a person who wants to watch stuff that is not necessarily great, then go for it. I mean, that's the option that it gives you to do.
So like we were schooled today that if you don't like the channel, don't watch it. Nikhil, Pahwa, you wanted to come in. I also want to bring in the fact that along with these regulations is a regulation that allows for government ads to be placed in digital organizations as well. Now, government ads, Janhit Mein Jari, PSA advertisement, tender notices, lots and lots of money. Nikhil, go ahead.
So I just wanted to remind everyone that there is already censorship that's taking place on OTT streaming platforms. So, for example, earlier this year, Netflix censored, Vikings in India, blurring out nudity and meat from a part of the show. Last year, Amazon Prime deleted an episode of the CBS show Madam Secretary, which dealt with Hindu nationalism. Hotstar blocked an episode of Last Week Tonight from John Oliver, which focused on our Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So there is already censorship that happens on these platforms of their own volition. Now what happens is that the government is essentially going to get a lever to try and force censorship where it wants to, and that's a real cause for concern. And there have been many discussions over the last 3 years, last 2 years in the entertainment industry at the IMAI, and 3 different types of codes have come up one after the other, which were looking at a self-regulatory approach in varying forms. Now, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has pushed back against those codes because they're not strong enough. They're not the ministry feels that they need to be a little more rigorous with how they do it. In fact, they wanted, for example, a list of prohibited content to be put together for the latest code. So with this administrative oversight that the ministry is getting now, they will use that to try and force for a particular type of self-regulatory code in OTT services. So we'll have to see what kind of levers it gives them. But one other thing, Faye, what we must remember is how OTT is different from TV, is that TV is broadcast, it's push. OTT is pull. We choose what to watch. It's private viewing that we do in our spaces, in our bedrooms. And fundamentally, structurally, there's really no difference between pornography and streaming services, because you are choosing to watch what you want in the privacy of your bedroom. And in the Supreme Court, in the porn ban case in 2015, Mukul Rohatgi had gone out and said that we don't want to do moral policing. He was the Attorney General of India at that point in time. So why is the government looking to censor, or looking to put in a code for online entertainment services, and at the same time going to court and Supreme Court and saying that they don't want to censor porn? It doesn't make sense.
Right. Varun, do you have your hand up? You want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah. What it'll also bring back is, I feel that it will bring back piracy. It will bring back that in a strong way. So whatever we don't let people watch in what is supposed to be mainstream, people used to go back to piracy. What stops me from, as a creator, and say, okay, I know that nobody will buy this piece of content I've made. I'll put it up on a torrent. I will figure a way to send it out to people, say, okay, this is what you need to pay to just get to access it. People will just download it and watch. So the thing about the internet is, the more you try to police it, the more you have ways to kind of get around it, but you can't do it at scale. You'll only do it as an individual basis.
All right, Abhinandan, Sekhri, the point about government ads now being allowed on digital, I'm assuming digital will have to register in some way. And in the previous notification, it said that also as a good thing, we will allow for government ads and for press cards. What is your response to that? And also, if you would spend a minute just explaining to our audience, this regulation already exists on television and on newspapers. But is there a reason why we're not serviced with adequately by television right now, despite the openness and self-regulation and all of the things that it allows?
I'll answer your first question. I didn't quite understand the second one. So can you repeat it now?
No, go ahead. Answer the first question and ask the question.
Digital platforms have been advertising for the government for a while now. In fact, a few years ago, there was this major scam. I think it was Madhya Pradesh. I think Newslaundry also reported on it, where sarkari ads are given to these small portals which hardly had any traffic. It was basically a way to reward those who you like. Just like Newslaundry has done a story, a similar thing on newspapers and periodicals, where across party lines, whoever was in charge of oil ministry or whatever came under them, whichever PSU came under them, were giving ads to those who they liked. In fact, if you go to one of the most hateful sites that claims to be news but is just runs hate, it has a smiling picture of Yogi Adityanath there right now. And Yogi ji has been advertising on that site for the last month. So it is happening already. I personally have a view on government ads. I don't think government ads should fund news, but that is the Newslaundry revenue model, because we say pay to keep news free. But I mean, so I'm not going to say what others should or should not do. If the government wants to advertise on digital and some digital are happy to take it, let them. I mean, so there is no change on that. The government has been advertising on digital platforms already. How we are different from broadcast is, like I said, there is no entry barrier. And that point has been made by Apar, it's been made by Nikhil in different ways, that there is no incentive for anyone to stay in India. If there is no entry barrier to, like, what are you going to do? Now, I just find this so amusing. So I'm just going to read a few more for your audience. Order dated 17/5/23 prohibiting transmission of Comedy Central for 10 days. Warning to Kalinganagar TV channel for apparent violation of programming code. Advisory dated 6/6/2016 to Oscar Movie channel for violation of programming code. Now, suppose someone does not follow the advisory. They'll say, chalo ji, हमने तुम्हें spectrum दिया ना, bandwidth, uplinking, downlinking, हम ले लेते हैं तुमसे. आप क्या लोगे हमसे? हमारी आप वेबसाइट ब्लॉक कर दोगे? आप हमारी मतलब IP address ब्लॉक कर दोगे? So those who are technically smart can also mirror it elsewhere. So it will be this cat and mouse game. I think it is clearly someone with very little understanding of law, economics and technology has decided this. It is a khayali pulao.
But if that's the case, then why are you worried?
Because it is going to impact us. See, the Sarkar can get you in 10 ways. I have dealt with them over the last 4 years. I have spent many hours in the Ministry of INB. I've spent many hours in the Ministry of Commerce. And when FIPB became FIFB, I have spent many. There are 100 ways they can get you. They'll freeze your bank account, yeah. But the point is, there will be no sense. Phir aap Supreme Court mein appeal karte raho. I believe half of what their regulatory, prescriptions say will not hold in court. But who will go to court? Who will fight all that and meanwhile get your bank account frozen?
Yeah.
I think even NDTV on that entire, at least one of those cases, now they're okay. They got the order in the Supreme Court, but what they for years they ruined them, no?
And it must also be pointed out that the reason why a lot of digital organizations are digital is because there isn't enough money. These are small organizations with a little bit of money. They just manage on most months to pay salaries, and they employ journalists who need those jobs. Just reading out some of the comments, Bharat Raval says, digital khatre mein hai. He also says that, there is a method to curb hate speech online. There are anti-hate speech laws that can be brought in. You don't have to specifically bring them, regulate digital in order to do that. Divyam says if the government is quick to regulate, will it also be as quick to protect, to ensure that digital news platforms receive a share of government advert without bias? I think the question there is without bias. And Bharat Raval says, what about, miscreants like Hindustani Bahao and others, Kari Manati, will all of them also be regulated? Technically, they're putting videos on the internet. So do they, Apar Gupta, do YouTubers or YouTube influencers, people who post on Instagram, will they all be regulated by the INB ministry?
I'd just like to take a step back here because there is some confusion, and I'll just be honest, it's in my mind as well how this will happen, and that's an open question because traditionally user-generated content, which is what this is called when possibly this show is posted on YouTube, etc., has been done conventionally with the Ministry of Electronics and IT. And the Ministry of Electronics and IT says that if there is a court order or a government order, you can go ahead and take it down, and that's under very technical thing which is called safe harbor intermediary laws under section 79. But the thing is that we are awaiting a regulatory framework. We have a nodal agency, but why is there a degree of nervousness? Even with respect to online streaming platforms, when a range of public interest litigations have been filed in the past, for instance, in the Delhi High Court by an NGO called Justice for Rights, which essentially went and said that there's nudity on Game of Thrones, right? And you need to certify it in the same way you would certify a movie which is exhibited for cinema broadcast or which is then replayed on television. The Ministry of Electronics and IT did something just 2 years ago. It said that the Cinematograph Act does not apply to OTT platforms, number one. Number two, it said you have a complaint. The court said, why don't you go and file a criminal complaint under the IT Act for obscenity under the IPC? So, with this change in ministry from Ministry of Electronics and IT to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, plus there was a one-day seminar last year in which there was the film certification appellate tribunal chief who was there in Bombay, who was saying that, yes, we should. And it's a very plausible argument because it takes less words. It's the same movie. Why should it be treated differently across mediums? But the thing, as we have just heard, is that there's so much digital first now. And the consumption, the creation, the display, the economics, as well as the technicality is so distinct. I don't think so it makes sense. So just going to this piece as well, I would just say that there are a lot of open questions. Any future regulation which arises or legislative framework which arises, number one, can't go with a blind side of convergence, that it's the same. I don't think so it's the same. It should recognize the reality. Number two, it should account for this level and fracture of trust amongst the stakeholders who are the creators, who are essentially servicing a very important public need. So everything needs to be done transparently and with adequate evidence. And I hope that follows. I don't think so we may get that, but I just hope for better.
Well, the other thing that I must bring up, and I think, Nikhil, if you would answer this question, please. Aggregators have also been brought under regulation. So aggregators of news, for example, viewers, InShots, Daily Hunt, Geo News, basically apps that pull or aggregate news from other platforms and just give it to you in an app. They are also now under some regulation, 26% FDI. Some of them have just raised funds. They're going to have to try and figure out how to give those funds, an exit. Nikhil, what sort of a challenge is that? And also, we must remember these are entrepreneurs who've managed to create apps, who've managed to raise funds, who managed to build businesses.
No, look, it doesn't make any sense to regulate aggregators on these grounds, because frankly, aggregators are showing what someone else has reported. They're not doing any reporting of their own. There is of course the issue of what kind of news items get promoted or shown more and what gets suppressed. But I don't think that's really something where there's an editorial function being exercised over here. Look, the worry for the government around the aggregators actually goes back to the Doklam standoff in 2017-18, where there was a rumor there was some murmurs from the Ministry of Home Affairs that UC News, which is owned by the Chinese browser UC browser, as well as NewsDog, were surfacing news items that were showing primarily the Chinese point of view on Doklam. Now, that was never proven, but I had a few conversations with people who said that the ministry is concerned about it. And if you've seen what's happened in the Chinese app ban a few months ago, some of these apps, including NewsDog and UC News, are in that list. So there is, because aggregators can effectively promote certain kinds of content that the government may not want promoted, they want some semblance of control over aggregation. But how is it even feasible to regulate aggregators on the internet, which is a global space? I mean, I use TechMeme for my tech news as an aggregator, and that's based out of New York. Will I now be stopped from viewing it and told to view only Indian aggregators? It can't work like that. You can't. Then you'll only end up having an Indian internet and a closed internet, and we will not have access to the global pool of knowledge that we currently have access to. The government feels as if it's losing control when it loses control over the narrative, when it loses control over the news, and when it loses control over what kind of content citizens are allowed to view. And these are all just mechanisms of exercising that control and trying to bully people and pull the plug on people who are when the government wants to do it, they'll throw the rule book at you, as Abhinandan had already mentioned. So I think on the whole, we should all be very concerned about this increase in control over content, whether it's news or non-news. I think it's also upon all players in this space to come together and push back against these moves. I know that some associations have been formed. Abhinandan and Dhanya have led the way on one front, but there are also associations on the other side that are pushing back and saying that there should be regulation because they have a vested interest in trying to keep it down, keep it to themselves.
Fraud, eh?
No, but you know, and we should also,
the broadcasters pretending to be digital players.
Broadcasters trying to pretend to be digital players.
Association of 20 people with NDTV, Times of India, Indian Express, and we are representing digital. Hai bhai? Matlab, seriously?
Yeah. It just doesn't make any sense. But
and also the point that you made earlier, which is that the push to bring in FDI, 26% FDI cap on digital news was actually done by mainstream media, because they said, if we have to have 26%, why are you allowing them? They should also have like a cap. So it's not exactly, you know, it's not exactly as supportive as it could have been, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I have a quick question for Varun. Varun, you know, coming back to OTT platforms and creative expression and what YouTube is allowing, shorter form content, 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute films come out sometimes. You know, people are able to put in small budget films. Artists who otherwise don't get work on mainstream for various reasons are able to get work on OTT because they have different variety, there are more opportunities. Is that a question mark that might be drawn on a lot of that now going forward?
Yeah, because, you know, everyone's going to start thinking, and I know for a fact, like my first thought when I saw this is that, okay, are we going to have to keep an extra lens on everything we create? Primarily because we don't know what this might imply for, like, is the sellability of my content going to go down if I don't stick to safe lines? Am I going to be able to put something out? Like, it could easily be that I'm a creator, I'm putting some stuff out on my YouTube channel. Tomorrow I want to sell a show to an OTT, and because of the content I put on my YouTube channel, they know for a fact, okay, this is something which I won't get. So I will start scripting that. Well, think of concepts that way. It's already happened, to be honest. I mean, Nikhil spoke about some of the pieces where the stuff got cut out, stuff got blurred, etc. But this is almost like it solidifies that more. But what I also feel is you can still get away with doing a lot of things as long as you're not in like I'm a podcaster, right? If something happens that somebody says something on my podcast midway through a one hour conversation, unless somebody really spots that and highlights it, is that really going to be regulated? Because I know for a fact audio you can't even do anything about it.
How many people you annoy, because then they'll take a fine-tooth comb on everything you've done. No, but and I'll ask the question about podcasts as well, but a direct question to you, Varun, is this. Would you think twice going forward, knowing that you are now regulated by the government, whatever that regulation may be, would you think twice going forward when casting an artist who speaks up a lot on social media?
So that's a tricky one, right? Because in an ideal sense, you would want to, but you would have that at the back of your head. And depending on what you're making for, who you're making for, who's involved, let's say if a brand's involved on it, it's also your responsibility to say, okay, fine, this actor has or actress has said something like this, so we might get some backlash on this front. Let's prepare for and we spoke about the Tanish thing a while back, right? Exactly that is the fact that the chances of backlash coming is going to be there, so you prepare for that as well. So it's almost like you're prepping for that kind of conversation online if you are going to cast someone like that. So it becomes a larger thing for the brand or for the platform to take on. And yeah, so it's definitely going to a lot of people are going to look at casting in that way.
Right. Also, quick question for Apar Gupta. What about podcasts? Savan, Prime,
It's audiovisual.
Spotify, Talk
It says
Radio.
audiovisual. It says audiovisual. And
Only
people,
audiovisual.
and people forget the Ministry of Information Broadcasting has conventionally played a very tight regulatory role over radio in India. Radio is very tightly regulated in India.
I don't want to give them any ideas right now because I said it.
Let me just ask that for a clarification. It says, so basically, just to give our audience an understanding, there is a law, right, which tells the government what business comes under what ministry.
Exactly.
Right? This law has been amended to include these businesses now. Effectively, they've added two sections, 2A and 2B, right? So they've added in that law, they've added two more sections saying these two businesses now come under the information broadcast. All businesses are slotted in that law one way or the other.
Exactly.
Now, it was willy-nilly, without really being said in the IT, and the electronics ministry. It is now in the. So there are 22.A says films and audiovisual programs made available by online content providers, right? So I understand this to be YouTube. I understand this to be OTT. 22B, news and current affairs content on online platforms. It doesn't say AV or just A or text here. It could be all three, right?
Exactly. So the thing is, they've chosen a ministry. So they've appointed a person, but they're going to assign that person duties, and that duties need to flow from legislation. So ideally, you want to see a legislation work through a process of public consultation, a white paper, etc. Deal with these recurring debates which take place around convergence, which I think need to be settled once and for all, because it's very different. TV is different. The online space is different. I think newspapers are different. Online journalism is very different. But I'm just waiting for that evidence to come out. I hope we can address this and put this to rest. But the thing is that without a legislation, also executive orders may follow in terms of notifications. It has happened in the past. Or there may be self-regulatory codes which are then acknowledged by, let's say, court orders, which essentially say that any complaint which goes to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting on, hey, why there is nudity on this OTT platform, and that ministry which receives it, which is the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, then sends it to the OTT platform or the self-regulatory body. And what you have eventually is an office which is called Standards and Practices, which essentially says what you can make and you cannot make. It goes into the format. It goes into the scripting choice. It goes into a very minutiae of detail of what can be done and what cannot be done.
Yes.
And it's really, really harmful.
I'll come back to you. Nikhil, Pahwa had something to say. Nikhil, go ahead.
So, Faye, one of the initial questions when I was looking at these OTT regulations, this content sort of self-regulatory code was, if I'm a filmmaker and I upload my movie on a UGC platform on YouTube, for example, is the treatment for that film going to be different from the treatment if the same film was on a Netflix, right? And fundamentally, that there should be no difference in that treatment. And by that rationale, anything that gets published by Netflix on its streaming service will be regulated in the same manner with the same set of guidelines, if the ministry imposes them, as any user uploading any content on YouTube.
Yes.
You have to have regulatory parity for the same piece of content effectively, right? And so what you're dealing with potentially is the impossible task of trying to regulate billions of hours of video on YouTube. And so therefore, I think the ministry doesn't know what it's getting into here. And if it's only going to regulate non-UGC platforms, then it's effectively going to benefit the UGC platform. YouTube will benefit from more creative freedom. And just because you're a streaming service, by the way, they haven't defined streaming services, you're actually at a disadvantage. In the same way, you will benefit from running a news blog on your own, as opposed to, in being in a company that runs a news service.
So, someone is using a dial-up tone, but
sorry, that's my ringtone. I have to leave. I'm sorry.
No, Nikhil, very quickly before you go. So does this mean effectively that we are discouraging as a country entrepreneurship in this space?
Absolutely. And that's something I said last year when the first set of regulations came out. We are discouraging entrepreneurship through this overhanded regulation, heavy-handed regulation.
All right. So you can now get that dial-up tone call. Someone's calling you. Going back to the rest of my panels, to just closing. So Varun, you can't really be very happy right now because we're not sure if podcasts are covered or not.
My worry is that look at TikTok creators, right? There were a lot, and that's an entire chain. Like there was a large set of people who were monetizing their lives. Like they were earning money by being creators and I prefer creators to influencers, being creators on TikTok. Suddenly they saw that go away. Right now, there's another set thinking, okay, till now I thought that I write a certain way and I build certain kinds of content. I have avenues to kind of go to, certain platforms. Now, all those people today, because they're also unsure about how they're going to be regulated, are going to start rethinking that. And so you're again going to have this scenario where you're going back to your television writing days, where we used to look at all those lines, okay, what can we say, what can we not say? And when Apar said standards and practices, I got a flashback from my life in television. And that is not something which anybody who creates content on television likes to have around. So yeah, we're definitely going back there. But just one thing I want to add is the OTTs, which are connected to television networks already, anyway kind of follow a lot of those rules. I feel it will affect a lot of them who aren't connected to a television network, because the ones who are connected anyway follow all those rules anyway.
Right. So my last question to anybody who wants to answer this question, actually my concern here, and tell me if I'm, again, overreacting or if I'm wrong, is that because the universe of content on the internet is so vast and it's impossible to have someone watch it and catch problems, it's just not humanly possible. Will it then be limited to helpful complaints from helpful citizens who will approach the Agri Ministry saying, look, please do something about this, do something about this, do something about this. Thereby, it just becomes selective, because then if you happen to be getting the attention of these useful, helpful citizens, you will wind up being sent notices, being asked to make appearances, you wind up in court a lot. Is that likely to be what happens? Apar, do you want to take that?
Yeah, censorship has always been biased. I think most academic literature concentrates around that. In fact, the censorship codes reflect that level of subjectivity in application as well. Because if you look at how the Cinematograph Act permits or denies certain movies, you're sometimes thinking, wow, that's something which I didn't expect to see on cinema. And sometimes you see, hey, why that stuff is censored, right? It was just so normal. And we've seen the same in television. I've seen a breast cancer awareness commercial be subtitled as chest cancer. Okay, I've seen mutton be meat. Okay, so all kinds of things do creep in. Censorship is subjective. I think there are very clearly demarcated bounds also for freedom of speech and expression. And I think criminal law is good enough for it. One final thing, we in India today are discussing extending regulation. Do we think people and their modes actually match that? Shouldn't we be looking at deregulation for legacy media, which is anyways moving online, rather than perpetuating something which has not worked for decades? And that's what I hope. And that's a very misguided, naive kind of thought. But maybe the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting can look at deregulation.
That is being too optimistic.
That's adorable.
I am.
Nikhil was saying they haven't defined streaming. They haven't even defined news here. I mean, is me giving on my blog the latest sports update, is that news or is that not news? It is so vague. And I have seen you talking about breast cancer being relabeled chest cancer. There's a film that was on with people are drinking whiskey, and it's not like a brand, from a decanter. It was like mosaiced. I was like, how do you know it was whiskey? Maybe it was Gaumutra. I mean, the filmmaker would have just said whiskey, Gaumutra pee raha hai.
This is the reason why you should be regulated.
like the most bizarre things come up here.
No, but last serious question, Abhinandan, the whole idea that, it's going to force a lot of people to look at registering overseas. We don't know if that's actually a solution and, what that regulation is going to look like. But who has the money right now among digital organizations to go register in Singapore? You have to hire a couple of employees to sit in Singapore. It costs money. Who has the money, especially in this market, which is brutal right now for journalists?
The shocking irony of our great leader, Prime Minister Modi, saying digital India banayenge mitron, and every policy is reverse of digital India. It is making sure digital is crushed and no one has any incentive to stay here. And you're right, the compliance cost of Singapore will go up because the CA costs, other costs. And also, I don't know whether, probably Apar may know, there is a rule called POEM, Place of Effective Management. Halanki, that rule is only applicable to beyond a certain amount of employees and turnover. That was not done, for us. That was done ki bhai, it's incorporated overseas, but your CEO is here, your board of director is here. So we are going to consider you an Indian company.
Oh.
So they will say, actually, if that's for 200 crore, we bring it down to 2 crore, we bring it down to 2 lakhs.
Yeah.
Basically, anything to throttle you. Unless you thoko salam, we will not let you survive. That, I think, indication is clear. And I just want to say, and this culture comes from a very deep-rooted, I belong to the generation when we used to create the master, we used to create it first on pneumatic tapes, then on beta tapes. And since I was the lowest in the hierarchy, then it was now you go. Before broadcast, I was supposed to run up the stairs and give it, yahan Prasar Bharati, job Prasar Bharati hai, AIR hota tha. And then the bureaucrat sitting would be in the master, he'd put it, he'd press play, then he'd broadcast. He would first see, has all the edits been made? He says, ye nahi ho, jaake phir karke lao. He just refused to air it. Now, those are the people we're dealing with. That's the mindset we're dealing with.
All right, well, I'm going to leave this here, but obviously we're going to have more conversations about this because this is a developing story, as we call it, because we don't know. We know only the first part of the story. We don't know what's going to happen. The government hasn't really told us what this regulation is going to look like. But gentlemen, thank you for speaking with us about this. For our audience, in exactly a minute, we will be back with Yogendra Yadav, who will tell us what he believes, and we're looking forward. The result of Bihar is going to have an impact on national politics and the elections going forward. What this means, really, what we're reading into it, that's in a minute. So don't go anywhere. You can obviously eat dinner when you're watching the conversation. So we'll be back in a minute. Thank you.